Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where entities ensue, but yesterday night I beat a game, so I kind of wanted to talk about it, have some thoughts, opinions, whatever, kind of want to get it out there, because, these thoughts just rail around in my mind, and I just kind of make these videos just to get them out of my mind and put them somewhere at least. But last night I beat a game called Lost Sphear. Now, Lost Sphear originally came out in August of 2017 in Japan, later came out in the West in January of 2018. It got a release on PC via Steam, PlayStation 4, and of course the copy I'm holding is for the Nintendo Switch, and that's the version that I played. This one in particular, at least the physical version, is actually pretty hard to find, so if you do see it, I'd recommend snatching it up if you are into that type of shit of like collecting rare games. It's not all that prevalent, so if you see a copy, it wouldn't be bad to snatch it up, but it took me about 30 hours to beat the game, which is pretty fair. That does not include the apparent post-game content that's in it. I didn't know that until I started on another game last night, and by that point I was pretty satisfied with the ending, so I wasn't too worried about doing post-game content. But it takes 30 hours to beat the game. Not sure how long the post-game content takes though, but the game is published by Square Enix, developed by Tokyo RPG Factory, which I believe is kind of like a subset of Square Enix. Kind of interesting because their first release was I Am Setsuna in February of 2016, which is what they're most famous for. It's kind of still a relatively obscure game, but at least in the JRPG community, I Am Setsuna is relatively well known. They released Lost Sphear in August of 2017 in Japan, January of 2018 everywhere else, and they finally released a game called Oninaki in August of 2019, and as far as I know, that is their last release, and there has not been a peep from them since then. I'd imagine since none of their really three games were all that successful besides I Am Setsuna, that they probably just got canned by Square Enix and just reabsorbed into the company, but none of these three games were really all that popular. I think Tokyo RPG Factory was pretty much created to try to catch the retro RPG vibe, and when they weren't doing that well, Square Enix just kind of canned it and reabsorbed it. But besides talking about the company, the long and the short of my opinion on Lost Sphear is it's a pretty alright game, to be honest. It's nothing crazy, and I do have my complaints about it, but I think it was a relatively enjoyable game overall. Like I said, it took 30 hours to beat as well, so it wasn't too long, so I can't complain about that either. But talking about the graphics and performance, usually something I really don't give a shit about. The graphics are nice enough looking. Can't complain about them really all that much. They're not amazing looking graphics, but they're not bad looking graphics, so overall the graphics are alright. Not a lot to count about. It's not like the graphics are unique or anything. They're just decent, honestly. They do their part. But in terms of performance is perfectly fine on the Switch. Maybe a couple of times there were frame drops, otherwise it runs smooth the entire experience. So can't complain about the frame rate. It runs fine. In terms of the graphics and performance, both are just fine. They do their part. No complaints. It does not hinder the experience at all. Now, in terms of the music and voice acting, soundtrack of Lost Sphear is kind of surprising because there's actually quite a few good songs in here. There are some generic songs in the soundtrack. Not all of them are great, and kind of some of them, one song in particular, the sad song, sounded like it was kind of riding the vibe of something like Nibelheim in Final Fantasy VII. That's the real vibe I got from the song. Other than that, there are some bangers in this game. The special enemies battle theme was pretty banger. The regular battle theme is pretty banger. The inn and shop theme is pretty good, has a nice bounce to it, and really my favorite song in this game is like the forest dungeon theme. It just has this really, like, I don't know, just really kind of weird vibe to it that I really dug about it. It was just so not ominous, but kind of just really had a forest vibe to it, kind of like a bounce to it that I really enjoyed. Otherwise, the special battle theme also really stood out to me too, even though I didn't hear it that much because I maybe did 5 or 10 special battles throughout the entire game, but it was really just had a nice bounce to it. And where the soundtrack really shines is where the songs have like a real bounce and charisma to them. It's really banger. Other than that, when they're kind of low-key, relaxed songs, they're not all that crazy, to be honest. The upbeat parts of the soundtrack though really slap, and so overall the soundtrack is pretty good. There are some real bangers in it, but as well there's kind of some generic songs in it that aren't really all that great, but it's kind of a 50-50 split. Half the soundtrack I really enjoyed, the other half I could just be like, whatever, it does its part. But in terms of the voice acting, game does not have any, so I can't really talk about it. Yeah, besides I guess battle chants and shit like that, and like them shouting in battle, and like doing their like conjecture in battle of like if they go down and die, they make like a death sound, or they cry when they strike an enemy, or use magic, or during the beginning of the battle, when they engage battle, they make a cry. They have like the battle victory chants and shit. But in terms of like dialogue, there's absolutely no voice acting at all. You pretty much do a lot of reading, none of it is read to you. Now I know for a fact that this was done intentionally to kind of catch that retro RPG vibe that they're going for with these games, but nonetheless, I think that it kind of detracts from the game. I do enjoy voice acting in my games, so the game just being silent pretty much the whole way through is kind of depressing. Like I said, I get they're trying to catch the vibe of retro Final Fantasies, like up to Final Fantasy 9, but voice acting would have been appreciated. At least it could have brought some emotions or something. Now to make up for the fact there is no voice acting, the characters of course do over exaggerated movements and shit like that, like you remember in Final Fantasy 7 and shit, where they do like the over exaggerated movements, or if they get mad they're doing shit like this, like they do all that. But I really wish they had some voice acting in the game. Like I said, I get it, it's supposed to be catching a retro JRPG vibe, so they don't want to do it, but I wish it had something more outside of like battle cries and shit like that. But in terms of soundtrack, 50-50, some of the songs are bangers, some of them are generic. In terms of voice acting, game doesn't have any, and that's a complaint for me personally. The over exaggerated movements really remind me of something like Final Fantasy 7, but I really wish it had some voice acting. Now in terms of the story and characters, the story is pretty much that a character called Kanata hails from a town called Elfgarth, and with his friends known as Lumina and Locke, they realize that the world is starting to become lost. Pretty much parts of the world are just starting to disappear from existence, and it is later learned that Kanata can pretty much restore these parts of the world back from being lost, quote unquote. So pretty much the game's story is that Kanata, Lumina, Locke, as well as 5 other characters that join them throughout their journey are pretty much going through the journey attempting to restore and save the world. It's a pretty simple story, to be honest. I enjoyed it enough though. The first half I really enjoyed. I would say about the last third of the game, the story really starts to fizzle out, which is kind of a disappointment. It just kind of loses interest in the last third. At least the first half, or I guess the first 2/3, the story has some real interest to it still. By that last third though, I really lost interest in the story. Within the first 2/3, there's actually kind of some conflict presented, and the fact that Kanata is like questioning his choices of allegiance and what he's doing is actually right or not. I kind of like that part of the story. Otherwise, the last third is just kind of like, I mean, it's just kind of like you're getting to the conclusion at that point. And the game does have a good conclusion, so I can't complain about that. But in terms of the story, at least the first 2/3 are good. The last third, it just fizzles out, to be honest. And in terms of the characters are nothing really noteworthy. Like I said, since they're not voice acted, they don't get a lot of character to them, and really the characters don't progress in their personalities throughout the story. They stay pretty static throughout the entirety of the story, and the characters there really aren't all that interesting, to be honest. They all have kind of tropey JRPG character personalities that really just aren't all that interesting, honestly. So the characters really aren't doing all that much in this game. They don't really show any progression. Like I said, Kanata kind of questions his choices and stuff throughout the game, but it's really not that interesting of progression as a character, because he really doesn't really progress all that much. But in terms of stories and characters, the story is good for the first 2/3, starts to drag by the last third, has a good conclusion overall, and the characters, they're really not all that interesting, and they really don't develop throughout the entirety of the story. But in terms of the gameplay, this gameplay is kind of divided up into 3 parts overall. You have the overworld, which is not really worth discussing because it's pretty much any JRPG overworld ever. Not really all that interesting at all. Probably one of the lesser interesting JRPG overworlds that I played through as of recently, I think, at least. Tales of Vesperia had some interest in it, as well as Bravely Default 2. This overworld has like really nothing interesting in it. You don't even do battles in the overworld, so it's kind of a boring overworld overall. But other than the overworld, you also have dungeon crawling, and then you also have combat. The dungeon crawling overall is alright, I guess. It's nothing too crazy. The environments aren't really all that interesting, to be honest. The real meat and potatoes of this game is the combat, which is actually pretty interesting. Now, dungeon crawling, you actually engage in enemies by running into them. You actually see them on the map as you dungeon crawl, so it's not like a random encounters, which is appreciated. It's kind of a cool system because you can do preemptive encounters and shit like that, where if an enemy's back is turned towards you, you can run into them and engage the battle and kind of get an advantage. Kind of what's cool about the system of battle is that depending on where your enemies are spatially on the map, kind of determines how that battle leads off. So if you have like like 3 enemies right here and then 2 enemies over here. That's how you engage in combat. You run into the combat with those enemies in the spots they're at, and while they're moving around just in the dungeon map, that kind of sense of wherever they are, just kind of they move around randomly. That's kind of a really cool idea. I really appreciate that, because honestly I don't see that in a lot of games. Usually there's kind of like a set pattern of where the enemies are, but in this game it's kind of random, which is really cool. Really, the transitions between in battle and out of battle are pretty seamless. You just run into a battle and engage. Once you're done with the battle, you're done with the battle. It's very seamless. I can appreciate that because it's kind of cool. So engaging the combat is pretty cool as well. The combat is pretty awesome as well. I would say the best way to compare it is something equivalent to Neptunia, but not really a Neptunia at all. So the combat is action turn-based, meaning that you just have an action meter that fills up, and once it's done, you engage in combat. But the thing is, you can move around the map and attack enemies from any angle, and as well, you have attacks that have a certain attack range and stuff like that, so ranged enemies can shoot through multiple enemies and stuff like that. It's kind of a cool concept, honestly. I really enjoy that type of combat. Really, one of the reasons why I enjoyed Neptunia and Death End Request was that type of combat. This game just takes that type of combat and moves it to an action turn-based format, which I really enjoy and I can appreciate. It's a really enjoyable form of combat, and really the combat is why I carried through the game so strongly as I did, because I really enjoyed the combat overall. Now, a few complaints to wager against the game. The game is relatively easy overall. I really didn't have a hard time with it. However, every boss battle is a spike in difficulty, and it is a big spike because the boss battles are hard in this game. Otherwise, this game is easy overall, but once you hit a boss battle, this game has difficulty spikes, and that's throughout the entire game. The game is relatively easy, but each time you hit a boss, it's just a difficulty spike, and it is really annoying. Now, one dungeon I can complain about is a dungeon called Mirror Lake. Not a spoiler really, because it's not really story related, but the whole entire dungeon is reflective and just an absolute eyesore. I wish they would have mitigated some other way or did something different, but Mirror Lake as a dungeon is an absolute eyesore. Did not like it at all. The concept for Volco suits are just kind of lame. Honestly, I didn't use Volco suits throughout the entirety of the game that I had them. It's pretty much kind of like a limit break. You can think of them as a limit break. However, it's really kind of not a good limit break at all. I did not find myself using it throughout the entire game. It's just kind of a gimmick they tagged on. I would also complain about the economy of the game. The economy is not all that great. You don't make a lot of money in the beginning of the game, reminding you that you're poor in a game and also in real life. But as well, the shopkeepers are stingy as all hell. And I mean, when I say stingy, they're about as gracious as a GameStop. They barely give you anything for items of actual value, and they charge a lot. So the economy really isn't all that great. And as well, the shopkeepers are doing you no favors, because even if you have really strong and powered up weapons that you upgraded, they will not give you shit for it in terms of money. So the economy is kind of trash. Near the end of the game, it starts to correct itself a little bit, but throughout the majority of the game, you're poor throughout the entire way through. Kind of a shit economy, but I digress. It makes it really hard throughout the game to upgrade your weapons and armor. As well, I can complain about the fact that characters leave the party, and for the 8 characters that you have throughout the game, 4 of them at any point leave the party, and that can be for a decent period of time. Some characters leave the party for 3 hours. One character leaves the party for 10 hours, and that's a third of the game. So characters leaving the party annoy me in any game really, but this game is pretty egregious about it, and it does it for like 4 characters, and it's kind of annoying because if you have your set characters, well, your set characters might leave the party, and there's about a 50% chance that they might leave the party because 4 characters throughout the story leave the party. But overall, the gameplay is pretty good. Overworld is boring, nothing to talk about there. Dungeon crawling is pretty fun to be honest, but the dungeons are not really all that interesting. The combat is the real meat and potatoes of this game, and it is really enjoyable. But overall, my opinions on Lost Sphear is that it's a pretty decent game. Obviously, I have my complaints about it. There are some things about this game that I don't like, and I think that it has a lot of JRPG tropes that kind of hold it back, to be honest. It does go for that retro JRPG vibe, and honestly, it reminded me a lot of Final Fantasy VII. That being said, the OG Final Fantasy VII was way better in this game, so it does what it does. It does give you a retro JRPG vibe. I can appreciate that, and I imagine a lot of other people also appreciated that, but it does absolutely have its flaws overall. Would I recommend it? Well, for $50, which is what they charge for this game, I can't really recommend this game. If you're interested, you can check it out, but I would say it can sit pretty far in your backlog because it's not all that crazy good of a game. If you want a retro JRPG, go play the original Final Fantasies because they're better games overall, but it's a decent game. I wouldn't say it's a necessary to play game though. It's fun, but it's not like a requirement that you can play it, but it's a pretty good game overall. If you do decide to pick it up and you enjoy retro RPGs, I think you'd have a good time time with it. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.